Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is what many of you likely recognize as Colt's Patent Firearms Model of 1851, or the Old Model Navy. It might be one of the most misunderstood of Colt's revolvers, though, because it wasn't invented in 1851. It was largely adopted by foreign powers before the US got around to it, and it was more often used by the Army than the Navy. We'll clear all of that up and more after we get this reproduction into the lightbox. With an overall length of 13 inches and weighing in at just a little over 2.5 pounds, this is certainly more authoritative than the pocket model that we saw last time, and yet much handier than the big Army quote-unquote Dragoon. We still have a 6-round cylinder, this time in .36 caliber. This, of course, is still a percussion arm loading from the front of the cylinder, and in this case, we are showing you what is a supposedly London-style model with a blued iron grip strap and trigger guard. Before we get started today, I'd like to thank all of our patrons for making this show possible. Almost all of our funding comes from direct viewer support. You guys make this possible. Additional support does also come from Ballistol, which is frankly the perfect oil for black powder revolvers. Just dilute with water in order to produce what's known as moose milk, an excellent cleaner and preservative for the most corrosive of firearms shooting. I highly recommend keeping a bottle like this, or maybe smaller, with you in your black powder range bag. A quick rinse will prevent a lot of wear over the years. Obviously, I was using this just right before the show. That wasn't planted just for this segment. Now, alternatively, if you don't want to carry all that around, you can pack away some of these Ballistol wipes, which are useful for far more than just firearms and can be pulled out and run as a patch down the bore in a pinch after you've done your shooting. That way, when you forget to detail clean your Abertis after the range, they won't be all seized up or eaten away the next time you rediscover them months later. And of course, if you order direct, make sure to drop them a message of thanks for helping to keep the history lessons coming. Now, before we dig into the history of this exact pistol, I do want to say thank you right at the front of this episode to the Rock Island Auction Company. We've been telling these stories with reproduction firearms, meaning we do not have access to the originals. Rock Island has actually been very kind in letting us use their extensive image library to help show you all the variations there are to see. You'll see their little tag at the bottom of the screen. They also have handled at least one of each classic Colt revolver because of their focus on helping collectors buy and sell these particular kind of antiques. I always get questions about values or authenticity, which is sadly beyond the scope of our show. So if you're watching with that kind of question in mind, maybe you ought to pop a message over to the experts. Over the course of our repercussion series, we've seen the introduction and evolution of Samuel Colt's patented revolving pistols. The first of which was the folding trigger Patterson, most popular in .36 caliber, but regularly produced even smaller. This design proved to be a commercial failure, and Sam Colt had to start again nearly from scratch. Working under the advice of one Captain Samuel Walker, Texas Ranger, Colt made significant improvements to his handgun. The result was a cavalry-ready .44 caliber revolver of frankly startling size, and its power is still the stuff of legend and some controversy. Frankly, it was just too big for its own britches. Its massive capacity meant eager soldiers could overcharge this thing, resulting in catastrophic failures. Now, the Walker had been produced under Colt's patent at Whitneyville. This was, to Sam Colt, unacceptable, and he used his profits from contracts with the government to open his own small factory in Hartford, Connecticut at 33 Pearl Street. There he produced an improved horse pistol. Still .44 caliber, this was slightly shorter and lighter, and the cylinder was not roomy enough to overcharge it into an impromptu hand grenade. This improved model holster pistol is now more commonly known as the Dragoon. Now, Colt managed to sell his Walker and then later the Dragoon revolver, which technically he considered to be one continuous model, to the US government thanks to material needs during the Mexican-American War. This conflict lasted from 1846 to 1848 and provided the necessary motivation and frankly just enough time and sales to get Samuel Colt's second attempt at manufacturing up and in action. With that war winding down, Colt developed a .32 caliber pocket revolver. This started out as a very simple design meant to capitalize on civilian sales with an emphasis on personal protection. Over time, however, the pocket model would evolve, taking on more features from the previous Dragoon and even our firearm today. We've done a whole episode on the pocket model and its evolution without stepping too far into the paths of its contemporaries. That is to say, the Dragoon, pocket model, and the revolver that I have here today coexisted for over a decade. As Colt made changes to one, they would often show up on the others. So no one episode on these three firearms is complete without an understanding of the others. Covering all three at once would, however, be a complete mess of an 8-hour episode, so we've gone ahead and broken it up for you this way. During 1848 and 1849, these would have been the only options available from Colt's patent firearms, a Big Army 44 or a Pocket 32. This leaves a somewhat obvious gap. The most popular version of the original Patterson sat between these models in both scale and in being 36 caliber. As far back as 1847, when the Pocket was being developed, Colt already knew he'd need an in-between option. At the time, however, Colt was just mustering his resources for building his own small factory. Renting the space in Pearl Street, he had limited resources and opted to focus on martial contracts for what's known as a holster pistol and hedge his bets with civilian pocket protectors. The belt-sized model would have to wait. As we've covered before, Samuel Colt took a grand trip in 1849, attempting to sell his pistols in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. While there was plenty of interest and a little bit of profit, it wasn't what he had hoped for. Colt's letters actually tend to reveal that he was extremely frustrated by the European aristocracy, where bloodline mattered far more than any innate talent or hard work. Returning home, Colt sought out a more diplomatically useful title for himself, and being a decidedly ignoble American, the best he could do was an officer's commission. The trouble is, the army didn't really want him, nor did he want to serve all that much himself. His solution came in the form of Thomas H. Seymour, an American lawyer and Democratic politician. Colt funded his gubernatorial bid, succeeding in May of 1850. Connecticut's new governor, Seymour, appointed Samuel Colt as an aide-de-camp with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Our man Colt saved on costs by not bothering to include the lettering for lieutenant when he began marketing himself as Colonel Colt to the world. In late 1850, he began renting a larger building on Grove Street, a former cotton mill. Around the time that he was moving in, the first references to a belt-sized revolver, a 36 caliber, began to appear. Samuel Colt initially referred to this as the Ranger-sized pistol. Examples were given away to prominent outdoorsmen and shown to the military authorities. Limited testing was done by the Army in November of 1850, about the time production seems to have begun. For reasons we'll cover later, it was not immediately snapped up, nor explored very much further at that time. Anyone familiar with the Dragoon wouldn't be much surprised by the first iteration of the belt model. Scaled down to 36 caliber, it still fired 6 rounds, was single action only, and used the same lockwork as its brethren. The standard barrel length was 7.5 inches, making it 13 inches overall, and weighed an average of 2 pounds 10 ounces. Again, like the others, the barrel, cylinder, and trigger were blued. The frame, hammer, and loading lever were case hardened, though this often has worn off by the time we see them today. The backstrap and trigger guards were brass and usually silver plated over. On these early examples, the trigger guard was square-backed, again like the early Dragoons and pocket models. Unlike those pistols, however, the Ranger size had some changes in its assembly. If you look close, the retaining screw sits below the locking wedge, and the spring clip points downward. Inside the firearm, the slot for the arbor is different. On the prior models, it was a rectangular hole through the arbor. On the new Ranger, it was just a notch. This actually proved fairly fragile and was dropped after only about 1,300 pieces were produced. That means by early 1851, the locking wedge was flipped back over, and the screw was overhead as well, just like the other sizes in the inventory. From the start, the new cylinders were roll engraved with a new design by Waterman Lilly Ormsby. This time, it was a depiction of the Battle of Campeche Bay between the Texas Republic Navy and Mexican forces, marked with the engagement date of May 16, 1843. By early 1851, Colt's revolvers were selling well enough in the civilian market. However, he still wanted lump sums of cash on large contracts from the military. This also serves as good marketing. Unfortunately for him, however, the US government was very stingy at this time, and the army quite small. With the cessation of the Mexican-American War, the US was also at peace. So, it was best to market his revolvers elsewhere in order to expand his income. The 1851 exhibition of the works of art and industry of all nations, more easily known as the Great Exhibition, was the perfect chance for him to show off. His revolvers were obviously a marvel. Multi-shot, efficient firepower, beautifully constructed, absolutely reliable, and utilizing the latest in machine production methods. That last one's very important. Don't forget that at this time, firearms in Europe were almost exclusively produced by artisanal labor. There were a few that were wholly produced by a single gunsmith start to finish. However, usually there was some separation of tasks. Large segments of arms, say whole lockworks, were being produced by one man working with his hands, and then what few groupings of these parts there were had to be carefully and uniquely fitted together by another skilled man. This formed a firearm that, if broken, had to be repaired with almost as much craftsmanship as been put into making it. This process was time-consuming, expensive, and required very skilled workers. Bringing hundreds of his revolvers to the Crystal Palace, the center of the exhibition, Samuel Colt would not only show the world, he would sell them on the success of his use of machines and assembly line processes to make superior arms quicker and at lower prices, and that could be repaired easier. Not that he wanted to pass on those savings to the end user, mind you, those were for him as long as his patents held. The idea was simple: train a man in one or two machine operations, have him repeat the task over and over, each time making near identical pieces. These can then be fitted to other controlled parts before final assembly. Colt's promise was that these would just drop together, but of course we know this wasn't yet the case. Truly interchangeable parts is a difficult endeavor. So yes, some final hand fitting was required even at Colt's. However, it was much less so than elsewhere, meaning only a small amount of talented labor was necessary for production. So of course, Colt's revolvers were drawing attention at the London exhibition. Running from May to October, Colt sold hundreds of samples straight from the Crystal Palace into British hands. More importantly, the Colt revolvers were put to the test against the competition, most notably the then quite new Adams revolver of 1851. Designed by Robert Adams and sold by George and John Dean, this was a percussion revolver constructed with a double-action-only lockwork. A single, finely decorated example of which was placed on display at the exhibition. It won the prize medal in its category, whereas Colt's hundreds of near-identical and decidedly utilitarian revolvers were only given an honorable mention. This would spawn a rivalry for British government attention. In June of 1851, the British Admiralty acquired 8 Colt revolvers for testing. The model, however, is not specified. That same month, we know John Dean demonstrated Adams' revolver for the British government. More Adams and Colt revolvers would be bought up in small lots for testing. Samuel Colt, Dean, and Adams would all begin pushing for public trials. In September, a .44 caliber Colt Dragoon was pitted up against a 500 bore Adams. Colt's pistol made use of round ball and conical bullets, each pressed home with its integral loading ram. The Adams, however, used unique conical bullets with an attached wadding. These were pressed into the chamber by the user's bare thumb. Ultimately, the Adams was faster to load, and thanks to its double action, unload. It was also, frankly, handier than the Dragoon, weighing significantly less, though it was only a 5-shot. After further testing, however, the Board of Ordnance reported that both pistols were unsuitable for service, the core reasoning being that they used much smaller, non-standard percussion caps. Despite this, however, Colt still managed to sell 450 revolvers in one large lot of the exhibition to the British government. And of course, this was because of a war, considered the 8th Xhosa War, part of the British colonial efforts in South Africa. In 1850, displaced Xhosa refugees hardened into another fighting force and began attacking British forces. The response was obvious: martial suppression. As part of these efforts, the 450 Colt revolvers, we're uncertain exactly which model, were shipped to the Cape of Good Hope for use by officers. An article reporting as much at the time was very enthusiastic about their potential, declaring it would prove a panacea to the ills in the southern hemisphere. I should also mention here that the belt model was evolving over the course of 1851. The trigger guard was now rounded. Hooray! It's also worth mentioning at this point that something weird seems to have happened. For this configuration, duplicate serial numbers sometimes turn up. It appears that upwards of 2,100 or so revolvers, produced in Hartford and marked with Colt's New York business address, but also marked by London proof marks, were created in a separate serial block, restarting from 1. Jordan and Gary's book, Colt 1851 and 1861 Navies and Their Conversions, speculates that these may have been shipped to the London exhibition for resale in the Empire. Coincidentally, commercial sales into Australia suddenly climbed thanks to the summer of 1851. That's because, just as the American gold rush was over, another began in Victoria, which went from a population of 76,000 to 540,000 almost overnight. The same story played out again, where hard-digging men felt that they were in dire need of personal protection against their less digging-inclined but still very excited peers. Thankfully, Colt's patent firearms were happy to offer peace of mind to both the citizens and the police forces attempting to keep up. In November, Samuel Colt was invited to lecture on his revolvers and their machine production by the Institute of Civil Engineers in London. For this, he was awarded the Telford Medal and an associate membership the following year. It's also believed that Colt's advocacy for assembly line production bolstered efforts in British Ordnance to establish a state arms manufacturer, moving away from the guild system and its various limitations. This project would eventually become what we know as the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Now, all of this attention might make you think that Colt's revolvers were turning an amazing profit for him in the British Empire. The unfortunate truth, however, is that despite his best cajoling, large government contracts weren't on the horizon. Moreover, his commercial sales were severely taxed, thanks to import duties levied on the American-made revolvers. If Samuel Colt wanted to make real money, he was going to need to establish himself in England. And so he did exactly that. In late 1852, he set up a factory in Pimlico, London, filling it with 300 workers. Overnight, he became the largest firearms manufacturer in England. This did not go over well with the locals. British gunsmiths rightfully felt threatened by the newcomer and his fancy machines. Colt's methods didn't require much in the way of highly skilled labor, a talent that they and their fathers had been surviving on for generations. The American found difficulty in hiring talented men, and those he could get often struggled against his modernizations. Orders for various tools, tooling, and machinery were also frequently delayed or delivered well below expectations. This forced Samuel Colt to bring in more and more from across the Atlantic, both materials and skilled men, which further upset the locals. Colt would largely employ British workers who were not from the gun trade, both men and women. Dressmakers, cabinet makers, hatters, porters, and more were drilled in simple and frankly repetitive operations, by which means they could earn a better pay than their previous trades. All this and more, by the way, was recorded in Charles Dickens' own magazine, Household Words. That's because the writer had been given a thorough tour of the works. Besides good pay, Colt's factory also provided unusual extras, like a bathroom and a reading room stocked with newspapers. As the factory opened for business, Colt also applied for a series of patents. Two of these, numbers 535 and 538, had to do with improvements in revolvers, technically more related to designs which he never did produce in London. We'll talk more about these in detail another day. More importantly, he also patented special equipment for production, such as forges, furnaces, barrel boring lathes, and an air compressor and mechanical hammer. Many of these were likely conceived of by Elijah Root, Colt's chief foreman and engineer extraordinaire. However, he'll be more relevant in our next episode. In time, the factory was up and running, and revolvers started to flow into the market. The first 2,000 or so of these looked a lot like this, nearly identical to their US counterpart. They also tend to have a mixture of US and London-made parts. A notable change, however, is that the arbors, the rods on which the cylinder rotates, tend to be slightly thicker than US production. The pistols were proofed in London and are marked for the London address on the top of their barrels. Production was of course very limited at first, but as the workers mastered their new trade and the machinery and parts supplies were figured out, the final shape of the London Colt took form. The most obvious change from the previous is the enlarged, flattish-bottomed trigger guard, which was also now made of iron instead of the previous gilded brass. These also tend to have slightly thicker loading levers. The screws were domed, protruding slightly from the frame, unlike the flush examples in the US. Around serial number 28,000, the cutout to ease loading bullets became more pointed. It's believed that this coincides with Colt's patent for tinfoil cartridges. This was undertaken with the help of William T. Ely, nephew of Charles Ely, founder of the Ely Brothers Cartridge Company. The design was waterproof, while still allowing the percussion cap to ignite the sealed powder. A seemingly random selection of London Colts also displays some unique features. A good number have turned up with the chamber mouths chamfered, making them easier to load. Rifling is also somewhat confusing. It's always 7-groove, but it appears to regularly switch between both left and right hand twists. I don't know of an explanation for this. Engraving is also encountered more often, as many pistols were produced as marketing tools and gifts. Now, of course, this is a repercussion episode, which means that this is a reproduction percussion pistol, not an original London Colt. That doesn't mean, however, that we can't take something of a look at it in order to figure out what the heck Colt was doing at the time. Alright folks, we have an Italian reproduction of a London-made version of an American percussion revolver known as the 1851, which is incorrect. Welcome to Repercussion, folks. Now, what have we got if we've never seen one of these before? Well, we obviously have a 6-shot percussion revolver, meaning that percussion caps go to the rear. You can see where they feed through that gap in the recoil shield. We load to the front, which would be powder, ball, or bullet right here. And then we have a rammer to set it all home. That is hooked up at the front by a spring-loaded plunger. There we go. And then we clunk our ammo all the way in. Once we've done all 6, we can put that away. The barrel assembly, by the way, is octagonal. 2, 4, 6, 8. Hooray! Now, assuming we've loaded this pistol up, in other words, we put powder, ball, bullet, we've put our percussion cap there, she's not yet ready to fire, because that trigger doesn't do anything until you first cock the hammer. This is single action only. Therefore, we cock and pull, and it will pop our cap and go ahead and discharge a round. If we want to put the gun into a safe position, we can lift back our hammer slightly, index until we have one of 6 pins, it's very small, but it's right there, in place, and set the hammer down. From there, the cylinder cannot rotate, and of course the hammer can't be dropped because it's already dropped. There's a matching notch on the face of the hammer, which allows it to catch on that pin. Other than being able to be rested on one of the 6 pins, we can also go ahead and cock this back to the first click on the gun. In this position, the trigger is the sear in this case, but locked in the trigger in this position, we can rotate the cylinder. This allows us to load the pistol and cap it without fear of pulling that trigger and discharging the firearm. If we go back for another click, right there, the system actually locks up. Because we're not currently on a stop though, I'll let that go ahead and clunk into its proper position. Here the cylinder does not rotate and the hammer still cannot be dropped. So this is sort of like a half-cock safety position. If we go all the way back, well, we're at full cock and the gun's working like normal. Pull the trigger to go boom. Now to a birdie, what makes this a reproduction of a London model is the fact that these pieces here, this whole trigger guard assembly, so all of this in here all the way down to the butt, and then picking up from the back of the butt a separate piece that is the back strap that goes all the way back behind the pistol, all the way up into here, and then has these positions for 2 screws to go into that frame. All of it, well, they've blued it. That's because that would have been the appearance of the iron trigger guards at the time. I do believe this is actually steel and not iron though, a little stronger in the modern construction. The original pistols, as made in America, mostly were produced out of brass. So this is a little bit better of a reproduction also by Uberti. However, almost all the commercial models were silver plated. The military ones, not so much. I guess this is supposed to be a copy of the military despite how shiny it is. Now, if you were watching our previous episodes on the Pocket or the Dragoon, all of this is going to be eminently familiar. There's no change in doctrine, and really no change at this point in how any of it works. So, the biggest thing to note is the difference in scale. Here's a reproduction of the Pocket model. Yeah, that's significantly larger, and you might think, oh, maybe it's kind of cumbersome, until you see it compared to the old holster or Dragoon model. Oh yeah, this is going to be quite the family. There you got Papa Bear, Mama, and Baby. And let me tell you, there's not much in the differences of mechanism. There's a huge difference in weight and handling. Most people, or adult males, tend to find this to be a little too compact to handle easily, and of course that short length means it's difficult to aim accurately in a hurry. This guy is far too large for most people to willingly carry around, let alone aim at full extension of their arm. This is just right. If you're hoping for a new animation, I'm going to have to disappoint you. The 1851 uses the same lockwork dating all the way back to the Walker, though it does sport the Dragoon era minor upgrades. So, if you want to see how it works, check out that episode. For now though, we should probably just ask May to go ahead and demonstrate this thing for us. Now, quite luckily, Colt's establishment of a London factory had been extremely well timed. Even as it was beginning to get production sorted, the British became embroiled in a war. This conflict largely erupted because of disputes in the weakened Ottoman Empire, most notably between the Russian-backed Eastern Orthodox Church and the French-backed Roman Catholics. French Emperor Napoleon III interceded as he wanted sovereign authority over the Christians in Palestine. This ultimately led to gunboat diplomacy, resulting in Russian expansion towards the Black Sea's warm water ports. These would conveniently provide Russia with year-round shipping under their own control. The British sought to check Russian growth and join the French and Ottomans in their fight. Unfortunately for Britain, they didn't keep near enough arms on hand and simply tried to buy up what they needed once the war was already on. This also meant that they entered the war with technologically inferior options compared to what they could have had if they had been up to date. Thankfully, Russia was further behind in many ways, but that's really no excuse. Once the orders were placed, production lagged behind as the handmade non-interchangeable firearms were time-consuming and expensive to deliver. Suddenly, that disdainfully machine-driven American method wasn't so awful sounding. The British Standard Cavalry pistol was still a single-shot percussion model introduced in 1842. It was largely issued to the Lancers, whereas the Dragoons and Hussars were supposed to have carbines. Shortages abounded, a substitution had to be made. Unfortunately, it was going to be expensive. Now, there are other stories of how Colt's London-made belt model came into British service for the Crimean. A writer for the Boston Journal once took credit, saying that he had been enticed by Colt to get an article into the Times which denounced the Admiralty for sending sailors with single-shot pistols up against Russians who were already armed with revolvers. No need to explain that those were, of course, supplied by Samuel Colt to the Russians. This might coincide with another story that Admiral Sir Charles Napier had personally requested 4,000 of Colt's 36 caliber revolvers for his Baltic fleet. Regardless of how it started, in January of 1854, the Board of Ordnance asked both Colt and the firm of Dean Adams and Dean to submit revolvers for naval use. While that was being considered, a select committee on small arms was assembled to consider the cheapest, most expeditious, and most efficient mode of providing small arms for Her Majesty's service. The big question was whether or not they should establish their own government arms manufacturing facility, again, what would much later evolve into the Royal Small Arms Factory of Enfield. Before that could happen, however, there would have to be a lot of arguing. Again, the British gunmakers were furious at this threat to their livelihoods, which meant the government had to find more American voices to answer their potential questions. You'll never guess who they invited to testify at the committee. Colt took the opportunity to attempt to produce muskets for the British. He also sold the same offer to the Russians. Colt's testimony was somewhat helpful. The biggest challenge seemed to be trying to explain the economies of scale to the observers. In order to afford the fancy machines that could spit out parts for a penny apiece, you had to pay out a large initial sum, which was later saved by producing a lot of the exact same thing. So a contract for 5,000 rifles might cost just about the same as one for 30,000, which is very confusing to some. The committee handed him a finely finished and then fairly advanced 1851 Minié rifle, asking him if machinery could produce something so well for a lower cost. Colt actually scoffed. There is none so badly made at our national armories as the Minié rifle shown to me. That arm would not pass one of our inspectors. While a lesser musket than that cost over £3 in the trade, Colt offered the government a contract for $1 million over 10 years, which he could offer at half the price and twice the quality. The trouble was that they would need a £100,000 capital investment to start this off. It's worth noting the commission also used this opportunity to all but demand that Colt reveal his true cost to produce his revolvers. He flatly refused. It was a secret that he would actually take to his grave. Regardless, he received an order for 4,000 revolvers in March of 1854. These were apparently destined for the army. Throughout the rest of the year, additional orders would total 10,582 36 caliber revolvers, also 2 4-inch barreled pocket 32s. These were mostly for the Navy. Much later, in August of 1855, another 9,000 would be ordered, though these were kept in storage. The price per revolver was £2, 10 shillings. This publicly available price would become something of a thorn for Colt later on. Those numbers do not include a myriad of direct sales to officers and other military officials. While there were no other orders for Colts in 1856, there was a contract for parts and accessories. Unfortunately, Ordnance also began ordering Dean Adams and Dean improved revolvers. These were built on the Beaumont triple-action lockwork, and despite being purchased in smaller numbers, had much more sway with the Army, effectively displacing any further sales of Colt's single actions. In land service, the revolvers were fielded by officers and sergeant majors of the infantry. They were authorized for emergency issue to the lancers and could be wielded by dragoon or hussar sergeant majors and trumpeters. Unfortunately, the revolver as a whole was swiftly abandoned by the Army, so much so that they wouldn't have another official model until the late 1870s. We've actually covered their strange attempt to suddenly catch back up in our episode on the Enfield Mark I, the pistol that finally realized their vision of manufacturing their own handguns at the state arsenal. The Navy was much happier with their Colt revolvers, keeping them in service through the Second Opium War in 1856. Now, those pistols that did serve Her Majesty can be somewhat difficult to identify. That's because those ordered were not immediately marked. Rather, some years later, those still in inventory eventually received a War Department stamp and its iconic broad arrow. These revolvers were usually refinished with the cylinder engravings polished off, and once case-hardened parts now blued. Some known examples have also turned up with holes straight through their grips. It's speculated that these were added to the pistols so that they could be secured in ship's racks. Now, while Colt only managed to sell to Britain proper in 1854 and 1855, he did manage further colonial contracts in 1856. Thanks to Canada's Militia Act of 1855, their 5,000-man force included cavalry troops, who were authorized in May of 1856 to purchase necessary equipment, including cavalry swords and one Colt's revolving pistol, along with a cartridge box, belt, holster cleaning rod, and nipple wrench. Approximately 836 caliber Colt revolvers were purchased from London. They were delivered in 2 shipments, one in May and the other in November. Examples were unit marked, including the letters UC or LC on the grips. These refer to either Upper Canada or Lower Canada, which is how the colony was divided at the time. These equate to Ontario and Quebec today. The upper and lower designations, by the way, seem a bit confusingly named to me. Unfortunately for Samuel Colt, that's about it for orders from England. Supposedly another 1,000 revolvers were sold out of the London factory to the Austrian government. However, the dates I have for this event don't align production in England and may represent some London marked pistols which were actually made in the US. I'm a little unclear there. This became a common practice after Colt's London factory was shut down in December of 1856. The lease, of course, ran for another year, but the factory was only kept barely lit, with small tasks. In the end, Samuel Colt had found it unprofitable. The British market wasn't opening up enough to allow him to make the profits necessary to offset the operating costs. The factory had also been something of a mess. He never found someone to truly spearhead production. It was frankly better to pay the taxes. It's estimated that only some 38,000 .36 caliber revolvers in total were ever produced in London. Another 4,300 are known to have been produced in the US and sent to London in 1855, just in case a large order came in from the government. Many of these sat unsold when the factory was shut down. Some were kept in stock at Colt's London agency for further sale, while many were sent back to the US, along with quite a few spare parts. This actually created an odd period in which some US-made Colts will display London-made parts. It's also worth mentioning again that not all London-marked Colts were made in London. Many were made in the US specifically for export to the London agency. Supposedly, the easiest way to spot the difference between these is to read the barrel address. If the dashes on either side are plain, they are likely US-made revolvers. If they are kind of fancy looking, that's London-made. At least, that's usually the case. I've learned that there's always weird exceptions, and I'm of course banking on the expertise of authors. Overall, the British experiment was a failure for Colt, at least in terms of manufacture. And for all the problems that we've mentioned along the way, there is one glaring issue suggested in Jack Rohan's book that I tend to agree with. Samuel Colt's greatest mistake in England was being too self-sufficient. his endeavor left no extra meat on the bone for the local smiths, nor did he tolerate the slow and somewhat careless toolmakers and mechanics in London. More importantly, however, he had no need for the aristocracy nor their capital investments. There was no English financial backer of the London factory, and therefore no embedded champion to push its cause. Owning land and taking a piece of various businesses was basically the bread and butter of the lords and ladies. If Colt wasn't going to cut them in, why should they cut him in? Regardless, his shoehorning into the Crimean War did manage to get his pistols into the hands of international armies and navies, and likely further helped to bolster their reputation. Private sales were also numerous enough to at least dry up some of his tears. And we'll certainly see a lot more success for this little Navy model in our next episode when we cover its use in the United States. While it might disappoint you because we have 2 episodes on essentially the same revolver, we're going to have to get May's opinion next time as well. Otherwise, she's just going to repeat herself. So, we'll see you then. And the manufacturer, Mark, I didn't recognize it at all.
So he asked you, is this Damascus?
Right. And I said, I don't think so. I think it's fluid steel. And then I went, hold on, who made this? And I tried looking at it, and I didn't recognize the name. Another gentleman said he thought it might be a derivative of Crescent. And I said, I'm not that familiar with how they made their barrels or when or what pressures they were rated for, any of that stuff.
Okay.
So I took the barrels off the gun, and I rang them. If you have a nice double barrel of that period, and you take the barrels off and just sort of hang them by the little notch on your finger as freely as you can, as little physical contact as you can get, hang them in the air and tap them, they should have a nice little ring to them. And if you hear certain things like a rattle, that can tell you, oh, the solder's gone bad somewhere in this thing, and if I shoot it, it's probably going to fail on the solder joint. You know?
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to blow up or anything like that, but it's not the sound you want to hear. It means you should be inspecting the gun much further. And so I express all this carefully to the gentleman, and he goes, okay, so I can shoot it. And I said, no, this would be the opposite of that. This sounds like a gun I would not shoot. And I said, this needs to go to a proper gunsmith before it's shot. And he goes, okay, so black powder? And I said, no, do not shoot it. Take it to a gunsmith. And he looks over at my friend, and he goes, okay, so I can shoot it? Like, what should, was this 12 gauge?
So you were just not existent. Right. You were a ghost at that point.
And he's going, he just told you not to shoot it. And he goes, yeah, but is it like 12 gauge?
What?
Capable of casting a single elongated bullet. And for every pair of pistols, 1 powder flask, 1 screwdriver, 1 cone wrench, and 1 lever for driving the bullets into the chambers. All of these accessories should not add more than $3 to the price of each pistol, for a maximum of $28. The entire